Hello and welcome back to the 2020 Wolfpack Warrior Workshop. We are on day 3, and we've got a really good panel coming up right here. As I've said before, if you're a history buff, definitely going to want to stick around for this one and engage, hopefully. If you have a question for Sam or Ken, make sure to put it into the question and answer session in the Excel Events platform. If you're not inside the event, go to wolf-pack.com/workshop, grab the $10 online ticket, and you'll be able to interact. With that said, let's get right into it, because I know this is a more in-depth presentation, one of the more in-depth that we've had all weekend. So I'm going to turn it over to our National Counsel, Sam Fieldsman, who's one of the most studied people in the country on a lot of this stuff, specifically Wolfpack's plan to end corruption, and University of Wyoming law professor Ken Chesnick. So, Ken, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks everybody for tuning in to the session. It's going to be a little bit inside baseball, but I think there's some important information here about how did we get to where we're at. And once we understand how we got here, maybe that'll help us find the way out. So that's the whole point. So if we have the next slide. My thinking on how we got here is that the Supreme Court of the United States has not done good work using O.O.D.A. I know some of you may have been at one of these workshops a couple of years ago. I think this was maybe in Salt Lake City that Todd Jagger did a presentation on the O.O.D.A loop, so he turned me on to this idea. O.O.D.A is basically a military strategy, how to get yourself out of a problem if you're a fighter pilot. You observe the situation or observe the problem. You orient yourself to the problem by doing research, figuring out what you've got, and make a decision on how to get out of it, and you act. Now, the key part of this is the action changes the world in some way, and then you need to re-observe the world after you've acted and see what the new situation is, and more orientation, decide, act until you keep going round and round until you solve the problem. It occurred to me that the law is a gigantic O.O.D.A loop. The way the law evolves is basically O.O.D.A. A court has observed a problem. There's a case filed, a lawsuit that has to be resolved, and therefore we observe there's a legal issue to be decided. The court orients the problem by doing research, looking at precedent cases and related cases, renders a decision, acts by filing an opinion, and then that becomes part of the body of the law, which the next court has to take into account when the new problem comes up, and around we go. And that's how stare decisis works. That's how the common law evolves. But my point is that the Supreme Court has done a very bad job, I believe, in the observation loop. The observation for each new case is unfortunately too narrow. They look only at the past cases and don't really have a wider observation field. If they would only observe the world, not just the case law, but the world that is created by their decisions, they might notice the problems that these cases have created for the world. My point is that they're not observing properly, and therefore, as we go round and round the O.O.D.A loop, the cases get narrower and narrower and go farther and farther off track, and there's no corrective mechanism, and that's how we've gotten into the mess we're in. We're going to go through a lot of cases where we started off and where we are today, and you'll see that a lot of the problem is a failure to observe. Next slide, please. So the other problem I want to talk about, and I've written an article about this, which if anybody wants a citation to it, please send a message to me through chat or whoever we're sending messages here, and I'll be sure to get the citation to you. That the problem with Citizens United and many other cases is we're relying on a bad metaphor. The Supreme Court is stuck in a bad metaphor. Metaphors are useful devices sometimes, but they can also, as Justice Cardozo observes, they can actually enslave thought. You can get trapped in a metaphor and not get out of it. And I think we'll see in this case we're going to talk about in just a second how that works. I think there are two, next slide. there are two metaphors that could be applicable to money and politics. The first metaphor that seems to be where we're at right now is corporations are people, and therefore they should have the same rights as people do. But I think it's a bad metaphor because corporations are fundamentally different from people, and therefore they should not be having the same rights as people. So another metaphor that we could use, and we should start to think about this and start messaging on this new metaphor, corporations are really tools. Tools don't have all the rights to do everything that other tools can do. They do what they do and only what they do. And therefore, and corporations are a very good tool. They're a good tool for helping us order our economic lives. They're a good tool for transfer of property from for over long periods of time and raising capital. They're a good tool for economic work, but they're not good tools for political work. And that's the metaphor that we need to think about. So next slide. Let's get into some of the cases. The first case is Dartmouth County versus Woodward. And this is an example of corporations as tools. The very first case that gave corporations some rights actually used the corporations as tools metaphor, and it's an uncontroversial decision. I think it's actually correctly decided. Dartmouth County College was created before the Revolution through a charter from the King of England, and the question was whether the government could direct it to do other things and change its form. And the Supreme Court said no. A corporation is an artificial being existing only in contemplation of law. Being the mere creature of law, it possesses only those properties which the charter of its creation confers upon it, either expressly or as incidental to its very existence. That's corporations as tools. We created them. We gave them rights. We can limit them, but they do have the rights that they need to do what they want to do. Excuse me, just getting over a cold here. So corporations as tools was where we started, the very first case that gave corporations rights. Next slide, please. The next major case, there were some other minor cases. The next major case, though, is the infamous one, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company. And this is the devil. This case, we'll spend a little bit of time on this case because it is widely cited as the grandfather of the idea that corporations are people too. So I'm sorry. The proposition for which it's usually cited is that corporations are persons within the intent of clause in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Problem with it, it doesn't really say that. The case doesn't really decide that. The case was about taxing fences. Corporations, and you'll note that a lot of these cases from the early part of this this issue. Excuse me.
Ken, you right? You want me to take over for a minute, or
no? I'm okay. I'll be fine.
Okay.
Are railroad cases. The railroads were the big gorillas back in the day. They are the ones that needed the most capital. So they were the ones who were trying to take advantage of the 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment was actually created to help the recently freed slaves, to give them some powers and give them some rights. But the corporations saw an opportunity to take advantage of the broad language of the 14th Amendment, saying that all persons shall have equal protection of the law. So there was a concerted effort by the railroad corporations to bring themselves under that protection by declaring themselves to be persons. And so the court reporter, Bancroft Davis, was he was the court reporter. The job of the court reporter is to take notes and to report to the public the oral opinions that were delivered by the court. He reports them and writes syllabuses so that they're easy for researchers to find. He's not a judge. He's simply trying to report what the court did. But the problem was he was a former railroad company executive. So he had it in, he was clearly on the side of the railroad companies. So what he did, next slide, please. So this is the lower court's decision was that the corporations were denied equal protection of the laws. And notice that the issue in the case is property rights. Were the fences of the corporations taxed unfairly? They claimed that the fences owned by individual people were taxed in a different way at a much lower rate than the fences owned by the railroads. So it all dealt with property rights. So the court reporter, next slide, please. The court reporter wrote in this syllabus to the opinion, not part of the opinion at all, but the syllabus to the opinion. The court does not wish to hear argument on the question of whether the provision in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids the state to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, applies to these corporations. We are all of the opinion that it does. So this is a shift to the corporations are people metaphor. But this is not necessary to the decision. Number one, it's basically saying we're not going to decide this issue. We're not going to hear argument on it. Therefore, we're not going to decide it. And therefore, it's only the court reporter reporting what the Chief Justice said before the argument began. I think that it turns out you don't even need to decide whether or not corporations are people because, and as you can see on the next slide, the court opinion itself does say that they are not going to decide this issue. So they expressly reserve that issue for a later time. They don't even necessary to decide that issue. But you don't need to reach the issue to decide that it's not proper to tax fences differently depending on who owns them. That's not a question of personhood. It's a question of the corporation as tool metaphor could have been used to get to the same result. I don't disagree with the result in the case. I think it's a good decision. I'd also want to point out here that Chief Justice Waite, I think he's lying. He says, we are all of the opinion that it does. And that's only true if a Judge Wood, who's on the Supreme Court at that time, changed his mind over the last couple of years. Because just a few years before this decision, Justice Wood, wrote an opinion when he was still a circuit court judge, where this was directly the issue was whether corporations are people. He wrote an opinion saying, no, corporations are not people. We just passed the 14th Amendment not very long ago. And the history of that is that it's designed to protect people, not human beings, and not corporations. And then he was elevated to the Supreme Court. He's on the court at the same time Justice Waite writes this opinion or makes a statement that we are all of the opinion that it does. So Justice Harlan, next slide. Justice Harlan says we don't deem it necessary to decide that. The decision really does not get to that issue. So although this is the case that people cite as corporations are people, the opinion really didn't say that. Okay, next slide. So we can cross out Santa Clara County because it doesn't really say that, but it doesn't take long for the court to actually go there. So the next case that comes along is the Pembina Mining Company versus Pennsylvania case. This case does not directly cite Santa Clara, but it does say, next piece of the slide, the great object of a corporation is to bestow the character and properties of individuality on a collective and changing body of men. They're not citing Santa Clara, but they are going to the spot where the court reporter was suggesting that corporations do have the same rights as people, as human beings. It's a dangerous step in the wrong direction. So this is another case involving property rights, as most of these cases are in the beginning. Next slide. Another railroad case, Minneapolis St. Louis Railroad Company versus Beckwith. This one does expressly cite Santa Clara as authority for the proposition that corporations are people too. It's a property rights case, so once again, using the corporations as tools metaphor, you can still get to this decision without having to grant broad human rights to corporations. But court does say corporations can invoke the benefits of provisions of the Constitution and laws which guarantee to persons the enjoyment of property. So again, it's explicitly saying that corporations are people, at least for the purposes of property rights. Next slide. Another case, and you see these are all coming up within a couple of years of each other. These are just a few years after Santa Clara County. Another railroad case, and more, again, using the property rights issue. And now, just 11 years after Santa Clara, the court says it is well settled that corporations are persons. And it cites Santa Clara. Again, misciting it because the Santa Clara case didn't say that, but they're citing Santa Clara as if it is settled law. This is well settled that corporations are persons. Next slide, please. Smith versus Ames. Corporations are persons within the meaning of the Due Process Clause is now settled. Another railroad case involving property rights, in this case, the regulation of freight rates. So you can see they're just building on a foundation of the false claim in Santa Clara that corporations are persons too. Another case that goes that direction. Next slide. This is an interesting case. This is where we're starting to the metaphor is starting to lose its power. Grosjean versus American Press Company. We're starting to go beyond property rights here. They're starting to grant, the court is beginning to grant rights for things other than just property. It involves a tax issue, so there is some property element to this, but the idea here is that there was a tax imposed on some news outlet, so the court ruled that the tax impinges the free press and reduces the free press. So now we're into First Amendment protection, not 14th anymore. And that is the first case that starts to suggest that corporations might have rights beyond just property rights equal to human beings. And again, you could have used the corporations as tools metaphor to get here, because a press corporation whose job it is to disseminate news might need to have the protection of the First Amendment. So you could say that's a right that tool, the corporation as a tool, needs to have to do its work. So you could have gotten to this result with the corporation as tools metaphor, but it really is still using the corporations as persons metaphor, which is the dangerous thing to do. Next slide. NAACP versus Button. And this is a case that goes all the way, that gives corporations First Amendment rights. And I think, and it's not a press case, it's an individual free speech case. And here again, we can see that while we might like the results because it creates power for oppressed people, it relies on the corporations are people metaphor to grant those rights. In NAACP versus Button, the NAACP, a nonprofit membership corporation organized for the purpose of achieving equality of treatment by all government, federal, state, and local for the members of the Negro community, enjoys certain liberties of political expression. So the corporation has First Amendment rights. There were some states, I think this was from Virginia. It's in the desegregation era after Brown versus Board, when there was a huge pushback against desegregation. Virginia was leading the way, pushing against desegregation. And the Virginia started to pass laws requiring certain disclosures by NAACP and trying to limit its ability to represent people in cases. And the Supreme Court said, no, you got to let them have that right. Love the outcome, but the rationale for it was corporations are people with political rights, and that is a dangerous precedent. And as we'll see, from there it gets crazy. And Sam, you can take it from here.
Thanks. The quote on the bottom of the screen there is not actually from the NAACP versus Button case. It's actually a description of that case by future Chief Justice William Rehnquist. And he used that as an example, not of how corporations have rights, but how after looking at all of that history that had come up until that point, he still concluded that corporations are not people in First National Bank v. O.O.D.A. And he said the questions presented today, and this is in the same case where that previous quote came from, the questions presented today, whether business corporations have constitutionally protected liberty to engage in political activity, has never been squarely addressed by any previous decisions of the court. However, the General Court of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and in this case it was a Massachusetts state bank that wanted to run campaign ads to try with the bank's money, which means the shareholders of the bank's money, in order to get a provision in the ballot initiative in Massachusetts about taxes. They wanted to keep the taxes lower. And in Massachusetts at the time, you were not allowed to do that. You could only have corporations spending corporations' own money if it was for an activity that was specifically what the corporation was working on. So if there was a banking initiative, not a taxation initiative. And as Rehnquist said in this decision, the Congress of the United States and the legislature of 30 other states of this republic have considered the matter and have concluded that restrictions upon the political activity of business corporations are both politically desirable and constitutionally permissible. And unfortunately, this was the minority decision because the majority of the court, under Associate Justice William Brennan, said that corporations are people for the purposes here. And you can hear it from his own words.
Although the provisions of the 14th Amendment speak of persons, corporations, both private and municipal, have been held to be persons under this provision for nearly a century.
So you can see the extension of that metaphor, like Ken was talking about. It's now just become completely accepted, and no one's looking. Well, future Chief Justice Rehnquist was looking, but a lot of the members of the Supreme Court were not looking at the origins and logic behind that to understand that it was originally about corporations as tools and not really about what the Constitution actually was saying. A couple of years before that, we had the case of Buckley v. Vallejo, which was the first major case that deals with the idea of money as speech. Congress had updated the campaign finance laws in the wake of President Nixon, and they were now limiting campaign contributions and spending. And this is what Chief Justice Warren Burger, who had been appointed by Nixon, had to say about those laws that were trying to rein in what Nixon had said.
The court holds that the Act's contribution provisions are constitutional as appropriate legislative measures to deal with the reality and appearance of improper influence stemming from the dependence of candidates on large campaign contributions. The court holds that the contribution limits do not directly impinge upon the rights of individual citizens and candidates to engage in political debate and discussion. The court holds that the expenditure provisions, the expenditure limitations, are violative of First Amendment guarantees, and they are unconstitutional. Those provisions place substantial and direct restrictions on the ability of candidates, of citizens, and associations to engage in political expression that is protected by the First Amendment.
So I hope that was loud enough. I'm not sure if the levels are where they should be, but basically he's granting First Amendment free speech rights there to corporations and using that to throw out the limits on independent expenditures, private spending by individuals. Individuals still weren't allowed to give as much to candidates as they wanted, and they couldn't coordinate with those candidates, but they were allowed to spend as much as they wanted. And this takes us to the regime that we had under Buckley v. Vallejo, and I'm going to let the West Wing explain how that worked.
Look, we can't spend soft money on a primary yet anyway, so...
No, he's passing the magic words test.
What magic words test?
U.S. Supreme Court, Buckley v. Vallejo. The court created a loophole by ruling that campaign finance laws only apply to communications that, in express terms, advocate the election or defeat of a clearly identified candidate for federal office.
You can see other cases during this time period on the left side.
If you don't put "Vote Bartlett" in the ad, you can pay for it with unmarked bills from a bank heist if you want.
And we should know. There's also footnote 52, where the court said campaign finance laws only apply to communications with the terms vote for, elect, support, cast your ballot for, Smith for Congress, vote against, defeat, reject, and that's it.
That's a real footnote. It was very important.
I'm savant-like.
If it doesn't use those specific words,
It is an issue ad.
You know what they say about money in politics?
no.
It's like water on pavement.
Why is it like water on pavement?
That's a good...
Finds every crack and crevice.
The standard ought to be, does the ad try to influence the outcome of the election? If so, you can't use soft money, period.
Well, zippity-doo-dah, Sam.
Excuse me?
That isn't what the standard is. I think we should run in the same election as everybody else.
Toby?
I've got to go back in there. When I come back, show me an ad without the magic words.
So, of course, that was fictional, but it was very realistic to the real conversations that were being had at the time by people on both sides of the political aisle. And you can see the cases that were going on, and some of them were pretty good decisions, like Austin v. the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, decided that which upheld the idea that you could have a limit that required corporations to form a political action committee with separate funds, where only people contributing to the political action committee, not all of the other shareholders, had to spend their money on politics. Then the political action committee was formed specifically to spend that money on politics, and if shareholders didn't want to participate, they didn't have to. As opposed to the corporation being able to spend its own money, which means the money of everybody who's a shareholder. It means that, when you're buying toothpaste, you're contributing to a candidate who you may not like. So that was the state at the time. But even under that, you can see with all these loopholes, it was still an enormous problem. John McCain had been involved in a major political finance scandal in the 1980s. And as a result, after that, he realized that you don't just have to worry about corrupt people. He didn't think of himself as a corrupt person, but he got caught up in the corruption of the system and ended up doing things that he himself would admit were quite corrupt. And he wanted to change that system. So along with Russ Feingold, he created the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. And one of the things that it did was ban soft money. So that's money that's undisclosed donations from corporations, unions, or individuals. This is generally money that's not being coordinated. Campaigns under McCain-Feingold, as well as political parties, could not raise soft money themselves, and it could not be used for campaign ads close to an election. And the McCain-Feingold law was upheld by McConnell v. F.E.C. And that McConnell is very much Senator McConnell, who's still the Senate Majority Leader. He was involved in a couple of these cases trying to dismantle the campaign finance system. This was the first one. He personally was trying to dismantle McCain-Feingold right after it formed in the Supreme Court. And then similarly, Beaumont v. F.E.C. upheld the prohibition of corporate donations to dark money, non-profit political action groups or political advocacy groups. So you couldn't have dark money groups funneling the money into political action committees with that. And then things started to change a little bit. Wisconsin Right to Life v. F.E.C. now in 2007, we had some new Supreme Court justices, and the magic words test was declared to still apply under McCain-Feingold. So that same giant loophole that we had in the clip that we just saw from before McCain-Feingold still exists. And in 2008, we had Davis v. F.E.C. That found it's a violation of equal protection to raise the contribution cap for a candidate running against a self-funded opponent. So you started to see more and more people who were individually quite wealthy. The Millionaires Club that we had in the Senate 100 years earlier, it never fully went away, but it was getting worse and worse and worse again under decisions like Davis v. F.E.C. that allowed individuals to self-fund their campaign and swamp out people who weren't themselves rich or didn't have a ton of rich friends. And that leads us to the decision that has become, I don't think it's necessarily the most important, but has become the buzzword of the whole campaign finance issue.
Who is Hillary Clinton?
She's continually trying to redefine herself and figure out who she is.
At least with Bill Clinton, he was just, good time Charlie. Hillary's got an agenda.
Hillary is really the closest thing we have in America to a European socialist.
If you thought you knew everything about Hillary Clinton, wait till you see the movie. Hillary, the movie, on DVD now.
That was Hillary the movie, which was run by a small little political action committee and 501c4 corporation known as Citizens United. Now, the question that the court had to grapple with, was that a campaign ad? Or was it commercial speech for an actual movie? And could they use the corporation's money to hide their donors? These are pretty reasonable and pretty good questions. Could they use the corporate money, or did they have to use the political action committee money only, where you could see the donors? And there's some interesting questions that you need to consider when you're looking at this, which is the First Amendment allows for some restrictions. It allows for reasonable, content-neutral restrictions that are narrowly tailored to an important government interest that deal with a limited time, a limited place, and a little limited manner of speech. So the restrictions in McCain-Feingold said that within 30 days of a primary, you couldn't have more than a certain amount of money spent on a political ad. And the court unanimously agreed that this was a political ad. This was not merely commercial speech, but they ruled that independent expenditures, even if they are clearly a political ad, do not even have the appearance of corruption. We're going to hear a little bit more about the way the questions should have been read now from Justice Stevens.
Example. Citizens United is a wealthy nonprofit corporation that runs a political action committee, or PAC, with millions of dollars in assets. Under BICRA, it could have used those assets to televise and promote Hillary the movie wherever and whenever it wanted to. It also could have spent unlimited sums to broadcast the film at any time other than 30 days before the last primary election. It could have avoided regulation altogether if it had simply declined to take money from for-profit corporations. All that the parties dispute is whether Citizens United had a right to use the funds in its general treasury instead of the funds in its PAC to pay for TV broadcasts during a 30-day period. There are many ways in which that question could have been answered without rewriting the law relating to campaign expenditures by for-profit corporations and unions.
Yeah, so basically it was a fairly narrow question that was being asked of the court. And on their initial argument, they heard that narrow question. Court then ordered re-argument to look at the broader question of whether some of those cases before, specifically cases like Austin and McConnell, should be overturned. And then ultimately decided to overturn Austin and to overturn the portion of McConnell that related to Austin as well. You're going to hear Senator John McCain and Russ Feingold on their reaction.
First, I was outraged. The day that Russ and I went over and observed the arguments, the questions that were asked, the naivete of the questions that were asked, and the arrogance of some of the questions was just stunning. Particularly Scalia with his sarcasm. Well, why shouldn't these people be able to engage in this process? Why do you want to restrict them from their rights of free speech? And the questions they asked showed they had not the slightest clue as to what a political campaign is all about and the role of money that it plays in political campaigns. And I remember when Russ and I walked out of there, I said, Russ, we're going to lose. And it's because they are clueless. Remember that day we were over there, Russ?
Absolutely, John. I couldn't agree with you more. It clearly was one of the worst decisions ever of the Supreme Court. And the trouble with this issue, and I think John would agree with this, is people have gotten so down about it, they think it's always been this way. Well, it's never been this way since 1907. It's never been the case that when you buy toothpaste or detergent or a gallon of gas, that the next day that money can be used on a candidate that you don't believe in. That's brand new. That's never happened since the Tillman Act and the Taft-Hartley Act. And so people have to realize this is a whole new deal. It's not business as usual.
Yeah, I still Russ Feingold's analogy. There were several cases that came after.
Can I say one thing quickly? John McCain was observing there was the failure of the Supreme Court to observe properly. That's exactly how the OODA loop went haywire when they didn't make a proper observation of the problem. Sorry.
Absolutely. No problem. That's a good point. Thank you. There were a few crucial cases that followed this, and there have been a number. These are some of the biggest ones. Speech Now v. F.E.C., which ended the limits on contributions to dark money groups in 2010. In 2012, American Tradition Partnership v. Bullock, which Jeff Clements talked about a little bit yesterday. That was applying Citizens United to state law. To show you a brief, and then there's McCutcheon v. F.E.C., ending individual aggregate spending limits. And this was another one that Mitch McConnell himself got personally involved in. I'm going to show you a quick clip from American Tradition Partnership. It overturned 100 years of effective Montana law. It overturned the majority on the Supreme Court who said that Citizens United didn't apply because the ruling in Citizens United was it talked a lot about the actual situation on the ground, but what they failed to do was actually, as Ken said, observe the situation on the ground. The Montana State Supreme Court, they observed their situation, and they knew that 100 years earlier, the copper barons were in complete control of their state, and they knew that without the protections that they put in place in 1907, which was around the time that federal protections and many other state protection started to come into effect, also around the time that the 17th Amendment was also part of that reform at that same time. Without those protections, they were in fear that that these special interests were taking over their state again. And so the majority in the court said it doesn't apply because of those facts on the ground. The minority, though, also said it does apply here, but they said that it was a bad decision. They just said they're stuck with it. And it ended up being a 5-4 anonymous decision with no hearing. I did a little quick research, and going back several decades, I couldn't find any other 5-4 anonymous decision without a hearing that had so little reasoning that was so controversial. And here's a section from the decision. It's a pretty big section, but it's very small when you consider the fact that that is actually the entire decision. That one paragraph was all that the Supreme Court took without hearing any arguments at all to overturn a full century of Montana campaign finance law. And the reason I didn't give the exact holding of Citizens United v. F.E.C. earlier was that it had a lot of nuance in it. But as we see here, nuance did not actually apply. The way they explained the holding of Citizens United here is really the way the court has been upholding it in the cases that came afterwards. In Citizens United v. F.E.C., this court struck down a similar federal law holding that political speech does not lose First Amendment protection simply because its source is a corporation. So you can see they're building on this metaphor, even that they had just done from 2 years earlier in Citizens United. They're now taking all that reasoning. They're not observing the effects on the ground that they had talked about, even though they hadn't observed them at the time. And they're now just throwing it out and calling that settled law. And the OODA loop keeps on rolling in. Then the 2014, and by the way, what all of these cases have in common, all of them were called at the time Citizens United 2, which is why Citizens United, even though there are a number of cases that you could look at, Buckley v. Vallejo is a prominent, that were maybe the most important, that one became the buzzword because of the way the media handled it. And in McCutcheon v. F.E.C., that ended individual aggregate spending limits. Money was funneled through state committees back to prominent national figures in both parties, and that robbed many of the states of their sources of funding. Mitch McConnell himself sent a lawyer to argue in front of the Supreme Court, even though he wasn't actually involved in the case, because he really has been a champion for dismantling the campaign system. And here's Justice Alito in his wild fantasy of what could happen if they ruled the way they ended up ruling on McCutcheon v. F.E.C.
That's your argument, General Verrilli, and about the district court's opinion is that what I see are wild hypotheticals that are not obviously plausible and certainly lack any empirical support. Now, you've chosen to use the same hypothetical the district court used about the $3.5 million contribution that could be given by coordinate, which involves all of the House candidates and all of the Senate candidates in a particular year getting together with all of the parties, national party committees, plus all of the state party committees. And that's how you get up to the $3.5 million figure. Isn't that right? Yes. How realistic is that? How realistic is it that all of the state party committees, for example, are going to get money and they're all going to transfer it to one candidate?
So, and he was right. It was not realistic to get all 50 state party committees to transfer all of their money to one candidate. They only managed to get 35 of them.
Reporting here, they explained that in August of 2015, so last year, at the Democratic Party convention in Minneapolis, 33 Democratic state parties made deals with the Hillary Clinton campaign in a joint fundraising entity called the Hillary Victory Fund. The deal allowed many of her core billionaire and inner circle individual donors to run the maximum amounts of money allowed through those state parties to the Hillary Victory Fund in New York and the DNC in Washington.
You can see there it was not a partisan effort. Both the Democrats and Republicans at their leadership level, you can see Hillary Clinton there using the decision that Mitch McConnell tried to get through for the same ends of allowing big money donors to corrupt the political process. And with that, we're going to take any questions you may have.
Okay. Hey, Sam. Thank you. Good stuff as always. And yes, there are some questions for you. Let's see. Where do we begin? Okay. This comes from Justin in Ohio, Viking. If we get an amendment that does declare that corporations are not people, will it have rippling consequences that disrupt or undo anything good in these old cases?
Ken, you want to take that one?
Yeah. I would say that what we should be working for is to change the metaphor from corporations are people to corporations as tools. That's the way to save all the good stuff. I think corporations do have value. They're useful tools to accomplish certain things that are good for business, good for the economy. And all the good decisions, if you base it on what powers and what rights do a corporation need to achieve its core purpose of helping us manage our property and manage our economy, change the metaphor to corporations are tools, keeps that. Corporations as people has led to all the horrible stuff. So the amendment says corporations are not people. We get rid of the bad stuff. Doesn't mean we can't still think of them as tools where they can retain the powers they really do need to do the good things that corporations do for us.
Yeah, I think a good example is the Grosjean case that you were talking about. For the free press, individuals have a right to a free press. Individuals cannot effectuate that right without the corporation as a tool to allow them to do it. So therefore, the corporation must have a right to be running a free press in order to make that right real for the people.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We will go on to the next one. Let's take Neil Goldstein from Pennsylvania. Is there a practical, legalistic way, short of an amendment, to more narrowly define or totally end doctrines of corporate personhood or money as speech?
I think recent events have proved the answer is clearly no, which is something we've been saying for a long time. Even if you go back to Barack Obama's last pick for the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland, who did not get onto the court, he ended up in one of his appellate court decisions, made some hints that he might also be going in that same direction of cases like Citizens United. He might have just been following what the Supreme Court, which at the time was above him, was doing, but it's still, even if we got people from a different party onto the Supreme Court, there's no reason to think that would change. And given the current trajectory, I think that's not realistic anyway.
Yeah, I agree with Sam. I would add that the only alternative to a constitutional amendment is for the Supreme Court to reverse itself. The chances of that just got smaller yesterday when we got the latest nominee for the court. But that's not surprising. The Supreme Court has for centuries been dominated by corporate interests. And I have no expectation that that's going to change anytime soon. We can elect Democratic presidents for the next 30 years, and they'll still probably end up nominating a lot of corporatists to the Supreme Court. So I really don't think that's that. I think the constitutional amendment is the only way to really get this done.
Yeah, yesterday Jeff showed a chart of some decisions by the Supreme Court that had been overturned by amendments. I did the math on it a few years ago, and it was just a quick calculation, so it may not be 100% accurate. But from my quick research, it looked like it takes on average twice as long for the Supreme Court to reverse itself as it does for the people to reverse it through the amendment process.
Okay, thank you. Well said. Totally agree. Let's see. Let's take another good one here from Justin. If Citizens United versus F.E.C. wasn't about the partisan person Hillary Clinton, do you think that Citizens United would be seen as such a partisan issue today?
Maybe not. I don't know. It's hard to say. I think Mitch McConnell also did a lot to create the partisan impression. I mean, certainly Hillary Clinton herself, shows up in one case as the victim and in another case as taking advantage of the corruption that these cases have allowed. So it certainly has, the decisions themselves are not partisan, and a lot of the people behind it are well aware of that and are seeking, James Popp, for example, who was the lawyer who was the architect of this whole plan for Citizens United and other cases. They're perfectly happy to take advantage of whatever facts they need that will lead to the decisions that they're trying to push. They don't care much about the partisanship. But in terms of public perception, that certainly may very well be correct. Although most of the public perception, if you look at the actual, not the name Citizens United, which is, of course, a conservative organization, but if you talk about the actual holdings and decisions, that's not partisan. On both sides of the aisle, they hate the holding of Citizens United if you simply don't say the words Citizens United.
Yeah, that's a great point. I work with a group called Wyoming Promise. We were working with Wolfpack and with American Promise, and we we're trying to get we did a petition drive a few years to try and get this issue on the ballot in Wyoming, a conservative state. And I was out with a clipboard asking people to sign. And if I could get their attention 9 times out of 10, they'd say, "Oh, money in politics, get rid of it. We hate it." So you're right. It's not a partisan issue. And I was able to get lots of Republicans. We had a majority of Republicans signing our petitions.
Yeah, I think the American Tradition Partnership is really a better case to talk about because it upsets people across party lines more easily, even though all it did was say the holding of Citizens United and say that it applies to the states. But it's so simple to understand that one, and it doesn't have anything to do with a group that happens to be on one particular side of the political aisle. So I think if you're going to talk to somebody about a case, American Tradition Partnership, which was discussed in tremendous detail in the film Dark Money, is probably a better one to use than Citizens United.
Okay. Thank you very much. Here's another one. Are state-level legislative races also held to the same magic words? And would you expect the state legislators to be personally familiar with that?
Well, actually, the magic word, this is the one good thing in Citizens United is they threw out the magic words test. So that's no longer a thing.
Okay. All right. That's it then. That's a fairly quick one. Here's one more. Even when an amendment is ratified, is there a possibility the court's interpretation of the amendment will present an obstacle to reform?
Of course there is, especially if the court continues to be corporate dominated. The problem is that we don't have any other means, any other tool to affect the change that needs to happen. There's actually a couple of problems. We have, once the amendment is adopted, it's not effectuating. It needs to be implemented through legislative action. So basically, when we say corporations are not people and therefore states and Congress have the right to regulate money, then they have to pass the laws that are going to regulate the money. So passing the amendment is a necessary first step, but it is not the end of the battle, because then we have to go back to the Congress and back to the state legislatures that say, all right, see, the people really want you to do this, do it. And we'll have to keep the political pressure up on state and national legislators to enact the reforms. But McCain-Feingold would be fine. We did it once. And McCain-Feingold actually, I don't think went far enough. It could have done a lot more, but it was all you could get done at that time.
Yeah, it was under the Buckley regime, so they had limited maneuverability.
Right. So I do think that the amendment is necessary. It is not sufficient.
It's worth noting that that should not be a defeatist. That should not be taken as a defeatist attitude. Like Ken said, once you've got this amendment and you've got this enormous national push, that gives you tremendous ammunition to take to the states and to take to Congress. And we've seen that work before. For a period of about 100 years, we never had a golden age of politics free of corruption. But for a period of about 100 years, things were moving in the right direction. Well, really more like 70 years. Things were moving in the right direction. From about 1907 to about 1976, when there was a big scandal, we created a new law that helped make it better. And the Supreme Court did not overturn those laws that helped make things better until the 1970s. So while we never got to a point where things were golden and the people just had their will heard in Congress, we were getting closer and closer to it. And all we really want is to be able to start moving in the right direction again. No one thinks that we're magically going to flip a switch and suddenly we'll be where we want to be.
Okay. Time for one more quick one. I think this could be quick. This is from NTAC Wong Boy. Does Wolfpack work with American Promise? And if so, what are the differences between the two organizations? Some clarity on that.
Well, I like to say that Wyoming Promise is what you would get if American Promise and Wolfpack got together and had a kid. We're the bastard child of the two of you, I guess. American Promise is not solely focused on the constitutional convention, on the convention of states. American Promise says whatever route works. Convention of states, great. We love it if it works, but we could also try Congress. They're going every direction at once, where Wolfpack is more focused on the convention of states. That's really the only difference. As far as I know, and Mike, you can speak to this better than I can. They get along great. Jeff was here, and Mike has been at American Promise events. They're working together closely, slightly different approaches, but hey, try every door until one opens.
Yeah, there's advantages to a broad approach like American Promise uses. There's advantages to a narrow approach like we use. It's really important to have groups doing a variety of approaches. Represent.us also looks at legislative approaches that help address some of the issues to the extent that is doable without an amendment. And they're very much looking forward to the day when groups like Wolfpack and American Promise get an amendment and suddenly their doors are much wider open to get better policies through the legislature. So you really need groups that are focused on different pieces of this that are working together, and we very much are. Wolfpack works with a number of local groups. Wyoming Promise that Ken is a part of is one of them, where we work very closely with a particular local group. There's Get Money Out in Maryland. There's We the People in Massachusetts. There's a number of these local groups that we work very closely with in different states, as well as our own Wolfpack volunteers.
Okay, well said. Right on time. Nicely done, Sam. So with that, we'll wrap this panel up, and we will be right back with a question and answer session that's going to last an hour. And there are lots of questions that people have been asking throughout the weekend that we
Ken and I will both be here for that.
What's that, Sam?
Ken and I are both going to be here for that too.
Yes, Ken and Sam will be here for that. Doug Hughes has agreed also to come back and take some questions. So that should be fun. So we'll be back in just a couple minutes.